All right, so today we're going to try to wrap our heads around this fascinating but kind of dense book from the 18th century. Is David Hartley's Observations on Man. And this book was a huge deal back in the day. I mean, it tackled some like really big questions about how our minds work, where morality comes from, even hinted at like spiritual enlightenment. And he does all this through the lens of Newtonian science.
Yeah, it really is an ambitious project, like trying to ground human nature in the same principles that govern, the movement of planets. And Hartley himself was a pretty interesting guy. He was a physician and a mathematician, and even a bit of a philanthropist. All this while he was dealing with some pretty serious health issues.
Wow. So it's like he was trying to find the laws of motion for the human soul almost. Yeah. Which, kind of makes sense when you think about the intellectual climate of the time. Like everybody was going crazy for Newton's discovery. So it's like, why not apply those same principles to understand ourselves right?
Yeah, that's exactly what Hartley's trying to do. He wants to create a Newtonian science of man. That's how he puts it. And to do that, he starts with this radical idea that everything we experience, every thought, feeling, and action boils down to vibrations in our nerves and brain.
Vibrations. So like I'm trying to picture like tiny little particles bouncing around inside my skull, creating like the symphony of my conscious experience.
Well, it's tempting to simplify it that way, but Hartley's theory is actually pretty nuanced. He doesn't just say, oh, these vibrations exist. He explains how they become associated through repeated pairings, forming complex networks of meaning and behavior. And that's where this concept of association becomes super important to his whole system.
So it's not just random vibrations. It's about how those vibrations get linked over time, creating these patterns and connections that shape how we see the world. Is
Oh,
that where his idea of decomplex actions comes in? Because it seems like all those highly skilled things we do, like playing music or even just speaking, rely on a seriously intricate web of associations.
that's a great point. Yeah, Hartley was really fascinated by how we develop those complex skills. And he argued that these decomplex actions, as he called them, emerge from a kind of layering of automatic responses. So we start with basic instinctual movements, then we add learned behaviors on top of that, and eventually, with practice, those complex sequences become almost effortless, like second nature.
So it's like learning to type. At first, you're like consciously pecking at each key. But after a while, those individual movements kind of fuse into this fluid, almost unconscious flow. And Hartley is saying that same process is happening on this much grander scale, shaping our thoughts, our emotions, and even our moral sense.
Exactly. And this is what leads us to another really fascinating part of Hartley's theory. It's his view of language as a kind of algebra.
Way language is algebra. That sounds kind of abstract. What's the equation here?
Well, Hartley realized that words are often like variables in an equation. They represent concepts and ideas, even things that we don't fully understand, which allows us to reason and communicate about these complex topics, even without having total knowledge of the underlying reality.
So, for example, when we talk about gravity, we're using a word to represent this force that we can't see or touch directly. But we can still use that word to, like, explore its properties and effects. It's like shorthand for something way bigger and more complex.
Right. And this is where Hartley's focus on association and context becomes really important. The meaning of a word isn't fixed. It's shaped by the network of associations that it triggers in a specific situation. Just think about how the word red can evoke all these different feelings and ideas depending on if we're talking about a stop sign, a tasty apple, or the feeling of anger.
Yeah, that's a great point. The same word can carry so many different shades of meaning, and it's the context, the web of associations, that helps us figure out what's really being communicated.
And for Hartley, this has huge implications for how we understand knowledge, belief, and even moral development. He saw language as playing this key role in shaping how we see the world, our relationships with other people, and ultimately, how we understand ourselves. So it's this really detailed understanding of language that leads into Hartley's ideas about moral psychology. He didn't just want to work with those vague ideas of good and evil. He wanted to understand how our sense of morality develops, like how we come to decide if actions are right or wrong.
It's like he's trying to bring that same scientific approach to morality that he used for sensation and thought, like breaking it down into its simplest pieces and figuring out how they all work together.
That's a really good way to think about it. He breaks down our emotional states into 6 classes: imagination, ambition, self-interest, sympathy, theopathy, and the moral sense. And he thinks these develop in a particular order, each building on the one before it.
So we're not born with like a fully formed moral compass. Hartley is suggesting that our sense of right and wrong develops through our experiences, through how these different emotional states interact.
Exactly. He argues that our very first experiences, especially those that involve pleasure and pain, are the foundation for our moral development. We start with basic desires based on our senses, like the pleasures of imagination, but as we grow up, these get all mixed up with social stuff, like the pleasures of ambition.
So, like, a little kid might be totally happy with a shiny new toy, but as they get older, they start caring about what other people think about that toy. Like, is it cool? Is it expensive? Is it the latest thing? Their desires become way more influenced by what other people think.
Exactly. And so this mix of imagination and ambition leads to self-interest, the desire to get as much pleasure as we can and avoid pain. Hartley sees this as a natural part of growing up.
But isn't that kind of a bummer? If everyone's just looking out for themselves, how do we ever get past that and start caring about other people?
That's where those higher levels of sympathy and theopathy come in. Hartley thought that through a process he called transference, which is similar to how associations are formed, our self-interested desires actually change into something more altruistic and spiritual.
Transference. So is it like the good feeling we get from helping other people might start because it makes us look good or fulfills some social obligation? But eventually, through doing it over and over again, it can turn into a genuine desire to help others.
You got it. And that's where the idea of theopathy comes in. Hartley argues that our ability to feel sympathy can expand beyond just the people we know. It can include a sense of connection with something bigger, like the divine or the idea of ultimate good.
Theopathy. So he's basically suggesting that our moral development can lead us to feel awe, reverence, or even love for something beyond ourselves, like a spiritual growth that goes beyond our own little egos.
That's a really beautiful way to put it, and it's this ability for theopathy to connect with something bigger than ourselves that Hartley sees as the key to reaching what he called perfect manhood. That was his term for complete moral and spiritual maturity.
Perfect manhood. Man, that's a pretty loaded phrase, especially nowadays. But it sounds like Hartley's talking about something much deeper than just typical masculine ideals. Like it's about reaching a sense of wholeness where our thoughts, feelings, and actions are all lined up with our deepest moral and spiritual goals.
Exactly. And this is where his concept of the annihilation of self comes into play. But before you start thinking he's promoting some kind of existential suicide, it's super important to understand what he really means by this phrase.
Okay. Because annihilation of self sounds pretty intense, even a little scary.
What Hartley's talking about isn't actually destroying the self. It's more like a radical transformation of our ego and all the things we're attached to. It's about letting go of that narrow, self-centered perspective that keeps us stuck in a cycle of wanting things and never being satisfied.
So it's like a spiritual shedding of skin. We let go of the old, limited version of ourselves to make space for something new and more expansive, like a death and rebirth, but on a psychological and spiritual level.
That's a really profound way to put it. And Hartley argues that this isn't a one-time thing. It's a continuous journey of self-discovery and growth. It's about constantly challenging our beliefs, questioning our motives, and refining what it means to live a truly virtuous and fulfilling life. And it's all tied to our ability for association and counter-association.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But how does this annihilation of self actually happen? What makes this transformation occur? And how does all of this connect back to his idea of universal salvation?
Okay, so we're talking about this annihilation of self as like super important for both how we grow morally and for Hartley's idea that everyone will eventually be saved. But how does that work when there's so much like obvious suffering and evil in the world? It's a pretty tough question even for a philosopher who's thinking about things from a religious perspective.
It really is. And Hartley doesn't ignore it. He talks about the problem of evil directly, or what's often called theodicy. And his answer depends a lot on that idea we were just discussing, the constant back and forth between association and counter-association.
Yeah.
Oh, right. So can you remind me how that all fits in with the question of why bad things happen, especially if we're supposedly all on this path toward perfect manhood?
Well, Hartley argues that suffering, even the really awful stuff, can actually be what pushes us to grow morally and spiritually. Now, he's definitely not saying that suffering is a good thing or trying to downplay how much it hurts. Remember, he was a doctor, so he saw how much pain and sickness can affect people.
Yeah, that's like walking a tightrope. On the one hand, you're saying that suffering is real, but on the other, you're suggesting it could be good in the long run.
Yeah, it's a tough balance. But Hartley's point is that suffering makes us question the things we're attached to because of our ego. When we go through loss or heartbreak or disappointment, it makes us realize how limited those self-centered desires really are.
So it's kind of like a wake-up call from the universe.
Yeah.
It shakes us out of being so focused on ourselves and makes us more open to those higher things like sympathy, theopathy, and our moral sense.
Exactly. And that's where getting rid of the self becomes so important. Hartley believed that suffering can break down that feeling of being separate from everything else, which is what feeds those ego-driven desires. And when that happens, it creates space for us to connect more deeply and understand things better.
That makes sense. But what of the people who cause suffering? The ones who are violent and cruel? Does Hartley think they're also on this path toward perfect manhood? I mean, it's really hard to imagine that, especially when you see all the terrible things happening in the world.
It's definitely a tough one, and Hartley doesn't have any easy answers. He admits that some people might keep doing harmful things even when they have the chance to change, but he doesn't think that means universal salvation is wrong.
So it's not like everyone's on this strict schedule to reach perfect manhood all at the same time. There's room for people to struggle to make mistakes and for some to take much longer to change.
That's right. His theory of how we develop psychologically is flexible. It allows for people to have different journeys. He really believed that humans can become perfect eventually, and that even the most uncaring person could become compassionate in the end.
That's a pretty bold statement, even if you're coming from a religious perspective.
Mhm.
It raises all sorts of questions about free will and the role of God and whether this process of becoming better is something we control or if it's just happening to us according to some plan.
Those are all questions that Hartley wrestles with in his book, even though he doesn't necessarily give us clear answers. But what's really interesting is how much he emphasizes that everyone's experiences are connected. He saw moral progress as something we do together. Like, as we become more sympathetic and understanding, we're creating a world where everyone can grow morally.
So it's not just about each person changing on their own. It's about creating a society, a whole culture that helps everyone grow morally. That's a powerful idea, but it seems really hard to do when there's so much division and conflict in the world.
It is tough. But Hartley's work gives us a way to think about these challenges. It helps us understand why people act the way they do, and it shows us that we have the potential to change both individually and as a society.
Well, after diving into Hartley's observations on man, I'm left with a lot to think about. It's a difficult and thought-provoking book, but it's also full of insights, and I'd even say it's hopeful. It reminds us that even though we might just be a bunch of vibrations and associations, we're also capable of amazing growth, compassion, and even a kind of love that goes beyond our own little egos. So what are your final thoughts after exploring Hartley's ideas?
I'd say what really stands out to me is how he tried to connect science and spirituality, the material world, with the world of values and meaning. He presents this picture of human nature that's based on what we can observe, but it's also open to the possibility of something greater than ourselves.
That's a great way to sum it up. And I think that's a great place to leave it for today. For our listeners, if you find Hartley's vision of everyone eventually being saved intriguing, if you're curious about this idea of slowly becoming perfect, then I'd recommend you check out Observations on Man for yourself. It's not an easy read, but it's definitely worth the effort if you're looking to understand yourself and what it means to be human better.